Welcome back to another episode of Dotwave. I'm your host, Johno Wells. Before I get going with this week's episode, I really want to thank two dear friends who have chosen to be our first patrons on Patreon, Dan Nelmar and Patrick O'Brien, for coming in and being the first patrons on our Patreon page. If you like what we're doing here and want to support our vision, please consider donating. Even $1 a month helps us keep the lights on here and keeps me inspired to find the kind of interviews that I know are top quality and what you're going to want to listen to. Our Patreon page is located at patreon.com/dotwave. Thank you so much. I'm pretty excited about this week's episode. This week we have Tom Erbe in the studio, and for anybody who's into Eurorack synthesizers, you've obviously heard of Make Noise. And you probably have heard of or own the Echophone or the Erbe-Verb, perhaps the Telharmonic, the Morphagene, my personal favorite, or maybe their brand new module called the Mimeophone. I don't think Tom would mind me referring to him as a visionary. He's had a really important role in American experimental electronic music over the past 30 years. In addition to creating the widely used early audio editing program called Soundhack and creating a whole bunch of really interesting VSTs, he's also one of the most sought after and respected sound engineers for contemporary music. And he is a professor of electronic music at UC San Diego. This is part one of my interview with Tom Erbe. All right, so joining us today in the Dotwave studios is Mr. Tom Erbe. Thank you so much for this, man.
Thank you.
It's great that we both live in San Diego because I think a lot of these interviews are going to happen remotely.
Yeah, it's actually odd. I've done a few podcasts and they've always been over Skype. So
right.
This is actually very odd seeing someone face to face.
Oh no. Well, I hope it's not too odd, sir.
Yeah.
So I don't know where to start because there's just so many interesting parts of your contributions to electronic music. Mm-hmm. Can we start maybe a little bit back? Like, how did you think that you might want to get involved in making instruments or music, or take it wherever you want it?
Oh, that's really far back. I mean, this would be like when I was a teenager, or no, it was before I was a teenager. I could give you a little family background. My great uncle was a radio engineer. Mm-hmm. He did marine radio on Mackinac Island in Michigan. So he was responsible for getting ships through some straits or something. And he lived fairly close. He lived in Elmhurst, Illinois. And I was just your sort of nerdy kid, loved science, and when I was about 8 or 10, he started giving me gear. So he just started giving me cast-off gear like oscilloscopes, test oscillators, microphones. I showed an interest, and I think no one else did. So it was like, clean the house, and here's someone who'll enjoy this. So I just got into electronics. The stuff, this is funny. I guess I started as sort of a gear boy. I was fascinated with how they looked. I would just take things apart. I remember taking apart the parents' TV when I was maybe 10 years old and putting it back together before they got home.
And it worked.
It worked, yeah. I was really lucky.
It's like, Tom, our TV looks a little pink now.
A little pink, yeah. And I just like the look of the wires and the colors and all that.
Yeah.
And this was late 60s, early 70s. So there was that sort of glow of optimism about electronics and the future and modernism. And everyone was thrilled by it. So yeah. I guess musically, I got my start listening to radio, of course. I remember getting a transistor radio when I was 6 or 5 or something, hearing the Rolling Stones,
Yeah.
satisfaction on it. And also remember opening it up and touching the inside and making hums and buzzes by just putting my fingers on the electronics. So this was early stuff.
Right, right.
So I was good with the soldering iron very early. Oh yeah, my dad found out I was taking apart the family electronics, so he took me to a TV repair shop one day, and he bought a sort of totally broken television for me to completely disassemble. So my job when I was 10 was to just take every part apart and examine them carefully.
Isn't it interesting, these little teeny things that happen for a kid that might seem kind of inconsequential? A parent's like, here, try this out. Like he buys you this TV, and like the future of what you're going to get into is somewhat defined in that moment.
Yeah, I think I was drawn toward these things. I think I was out of control already. The other thing is, you'd find out about things through magazines at that point in time. So no internet. You go to the library and start pulling magazines off the shelf.
Right.
Because libraries had all the magazines, and I would get all the radio electronics magazines. I would get all the music magazines, and I'd just pore over them. And I remember an article, how to make a polyphonic synthesizer. And this I may have been about 14. I remember reading the whole thing and just understanding everything from octave divider chips to just how the whole thing worked. And I decided at that point that I needed to modify it, So I started drawing block diagrams of how I could change this polyphonic synthesizer.
Wow.
Totally stupid ideas, but, I was just really wanting to do that stuff. And then my big formal introduction to electronics came when I was about 15. I joined the high school radio station, and they found out that I could solder, so I was immediately made technical director. And the previous technical director trained me. He saw that I really didn't know anything, so he taught me what a balanced line was. He showed me how to put together tape decks, how to calibrate things, all the good stuff. And one day he just gave me a task to hook up some stuff in the studio and just left me alone in the studio with no instruction whatsoever. So I had to go through this big radio studio with, it had 3 control rooms, and trace how the wires moved through all the control rooms and figure out how to put things together.
Mm-hmm. At a high school radio station.
Yeah.
Do you think high schools have radio stations anymore?
No, they used to have a provision for, I think it was a certain class of radio station. It was a kind of low power FM radio station.
That's amazing.
And they would allow you to go on the air with 10 watts. So that was great because it would cover about a mile. You'd hit your high school audience. All your friends would listen to you, or rather they wouldn't, but it had that outreach. And at a certain point, I think the FCC raised the minimum wattage requirement to 100 watts. And that put out of business all the high school radio stations because for a 10-watt transmitter was not that expensive. We did bake sales and we bought a new transmitter, But at a certain point, the FCC got rid of low power FM. And now it's come back to a certain extent. But I think it was, and also at that point, any radio station below 92 had to be a public service nonprofit radio station. So it's a little more protected back then. All that's gone away, of course.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have had a radio station at my high school.
Yeah.
I would have been all up in it.
And at that point, I had, just sort of basic musical tastes. But at that point, it just accelerated my musical tastes because my friends were like, what are you into? What do you think of Hawkwind?
Right.
I'm like, what? I have no idea. I was very shy, so I typically didn't say anything and maybe nodded a little bit, so they assumed, yeah, Tom knows who
Right,
Hawkwind
right.
is, or, you know, and so...
Tom's cool, man.
Yeah, Tom's cool, you know, so I would get into different stuff, and our sort of typical weekend, recreation was going down to Chicago, taking the train, going to record stores, checking out the new singles, and this was about the time that punk broke, so we were just like buying the new Sex Pistols singles and
Right.
checking it out, putting it on the air, that kind of stuff. So
That's such a great time.
and then my taste went off the deep end. I started getting into really strange stuff. So that's
Like what?
well, like the first Residence albums.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
One of my favorite albums was the Third Wreck and Roll, which is their take on 1960s hits. It's before the Residents got a sampler, so they were doing most of their stuff on like ARP string ensembles and out of tune pianos and sort of saxophone, trumpet, non rock and roll type instruments. Yeah.
Okay, so any bands which you were in high school afterwards?
No, I got in a band when I was in college and played synthesizer,
Uh-huh.
and we did that for like 2-3 years. So that one band occupied most of my college time, and this happened maybe in my sophomore year till when I graduated.
And was this like a band, like we want to get signed and become rock stars, or it was just something to do? Or?
This was in Champaign, Urbana, and I don't think anyone had aspirations towards actually getting signed anywhere. We just wanted to play the scene, and
Right.
I remember we probably rehearsed for a whole year before we ever played anywhere. When we decided, at first we thought we're just going to be a fast synth band. So we were thinking of, I guess our inspirations would be things like Tuxedo Moon, this sort of like edgy synth music. But then a guitarist got added and a drummer got added. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I certainly got to know the Sequential Circuits Pro 1 during that, which was my main instrument.
Okay.
During college, I also worked at a couple of radio stations, volunteered at a film distribution company that did small film distribution. I wrote capsule reviews there. I ran a fanzine, stuff like that.
That was the fanzine era, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that continued until the early 90s.
Yeah, so this was 1982,
Right.
1984.
Okay. So that was the birth of the fanzine, baby.
Yeah. It was at the time when my fanzine would get reviewed by other fanzines.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah. So we interviewed all the bands as they came through town, that kind of thing.
It was so grassrootsy.
Covered all the local scene.
That's so cool. We had friends in the punk scene in Riverside in the late 80s and 90s. And everybody had fanzines, all the local nothing labels did, and they were all really cool.
Yeah.
They were all photocopied and gritty and had little comic moments in them, and they're just rad.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so neat.
Yeah, I mean, we just sort of handmade it. I had never done anything like that before, but I found a place that printed newspapers, printed the local, like, tiny town newspapers, and found friends who took, photographers, I became the editor.
That's so cool.
It was very strange. I'd never done anything like that, and I just started organizing all these people.
So Tom Erbe, the community organizer.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I would just sort of stick to ideas. Other people, it was another group of people who started it, but I came on and I just like, okay, issue 2, issue 3, let's keep it going.
That's great. Do you have those anymore?
No, I don't. I used to have a big box of this stuff, and I realized it was in libraries, and I didn't need to keep them. So
You parted with it.
I dumped it all. Yeah. Well, this thing, I've done a lot of stuff, right?
Right.
And I mean, I've been making computer music software since maybe late 80s. And if you just keep on working on stuff, I've recorded maybe 150 CDs. If you just keep your stuff, you end up being your own archivist at a certain point. And so it just starts weighing you down.
Let's rewind here a little bit.
Yeah.
150 CDs.
Yeah.
As just you.
No. I'm as a recording engineer.
Okay, got it. I got scared there for a minute.
Yeah, I have this big
Tom, that's
career as an artist.
That's a really prolific career, Tom.
No. I mean, mostly as a recording engineer, sometimes electronic musician, sometimes whatever.
I got really scared there for a minute.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, that's a really prolific career, man.
But yeah, I realized at a certain point I just had to throw out old stuff.
Okay.
So
you mentioned software design, which it's been a huge part of your life with Soundhack, which is your company which you make software with and also collaborate with hardware manufacturers. Is that an okay way to kind of summarize that?
Yeah. I mean, Soundhack is just sort of the name for all the things I do. Maybe it's my company.
When did that start?
It started with a program called Soundhack that I wrote I started writing it about 1989 and came out with the first release in 1991. And this was a program that was sort of offline sound processor, and it could do time stretching using the phase vocoder. It could do sound file convolution. It had filters for like binaural spatialization. It had a spectral dynamics processor in it. It had all these sort of things that at the time I thought I wanted to focus on effects that would never be commercial. At least in my mind, no one's ever going to want to do these. That also were maybe they weren't commercially suitable because they were so slow. They really took up the whole computer. And at this point, people would typically have like a Mac 2 SI or just these really slow computers. And so this sound processing would take, maybe 6-10 hours to make a reasonable sound. But it was stuff like, let's take the sound and slow it down 1,000 times. So 10 seconds of sound becomes 10,000 seconds, becomes enormously long. And you get these slow, wonderful transitions from one phoneme to another.
Right.
One bit of sibilance would last a whole, 5 minutes, that kind of thing. So it was this kind of sound that I wanted to create. And I started working on this stuff, I mean, partially out of just sheer interest for the technology, but also I felt that studio tools at that time were kind of starved. We had just made this transition to digital, or we're sort of halfway through it. And all the old analog audio processing was going away. Synthesizers were no longer analog. They were sort of contained. Synthesizers were now all keyboards, Yeah,
right.
They were, the performance instruments, and nothing wrong with that. But it was just the time where you couldn't do like creative sort of weirdo type sound, the type of sound where you hear it on a CD or you hear it on the radio and you just go like, where did that come from? How did they make that? So this is a type of tool I wanted to start creating, and that's where Soundhack came from.
Because this is the era of the DX7.
Yeah,
where everybody's like,
definitely.
I've got that patch. I know, I want to sound like whatever.
Yeah.
So you were trying to kind of break that mold a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've used DX7s on recordings.
Sure.
But I mean, at that point, when I'd go into the studio, we would also be doing tons of processing. So we'd be taking, reverbs, putting them in compressors, and then feeding them back through mixing consoles and trying to get sounds that were just a little more involved. The old using the studio as an instrument type thing.
It's so cool to use something like an instrument that is just not an instrument, but to kind of change our perception of maybe this is an instrument. Maybe I could be creative with a mixer.
Well, yeah, you use these things for sort of their utility purposes so much.
Right.
You use EQs to just sort of, brighten up the sound or
Mm-hmm.
beef it up a little bit, that you don't think about using them in any other way.
Yeah.
But really, there's filters in there, there's amplifiers in there, the things distort in nice ways. And one of the cool things is just discovering feedback and electronic feedback and what happens when you plug an output into any random input and then open up a channel.
Yeah.
And it especially gets interesting when there may be some digital things involved, or if there's a little delay line involved, so the feedback takes a little while to build up.
Mm-hmm.
And this stuff was sort of the basis of a lot of David Tudor's synthesis work, where he would just fill a table full of guitar pedals and little mixers and handmade devices, contact microphones, and he'd just build these feedback networks and, get them going, get them making sound.
Mm-hmm.
And soon you're involved in sonic places that you wouldn't get to.
Right. This is it's not a patch on your DX7 anymore, right?
No, this is definitely not marketable. It's,
right.
No one's going to sell you the David Tudor table. Well, maybe now they will, but
Right.
at that point, it's just, you'd have to be really thinking about using things in ways that they weren't meant to be used as.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
But I mean, simply in the studio, one thing we would like to do in production is just tune patches to the current pitch. Simple thing. We'd be programming our like a lexicon device to use different resonant tones, and maybe a lot of people did this, but it took work. It took a bit of work.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to control it. You do MIDI programming to control it, to make sure it followed the song, and for most commercial music production, you just wouldn't do that because it took too much time.
Mm-hmm.
And also took some patience with the engineers. The artist didn't always want to see the engineer fiddling with something for an hour to get that right sound.
Right. And that's a certain kind of engineer also.
Yeah.
I would think probably most aren't like that and are a lot more utilitarian.
Oh, yeah.
Let's get this done.
Well, it takes a while. It takes a while to get there as an engineer, too.
Sure.
I know I can go into a session now and get a CD mastered in one day if I need to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll also go in there and I can take a whole summer working on a CD if that's what we're doing.
Right. If that's where the budget is.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, let's be real.
Well, sometimes there is no budget. It's just
right.
time.
Yeah.
People have the summer off, and
yeah.
I mean, that's budget itself.
But passion projects are really at the heart of so much good art.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the program Soundhack happened, and then how did the company progress?
Oh, it wasn't a company. I was just doing this as a project. I worked at Mills College at that point. I sent it out, and people could get it through FTP or other sort of primitive internet protocols. I would send notices out on mailing lists, and it just spread all over. So soon a lot of people were using it. People from Negative Land were using it. People in film sound were using it. Trent Reznor was using it. I found out. So it was a hit. It was free for the most part, so it's not hard to have a free hit. Sure.
Right.
And there were other good programs out at that point, which also were free and did weird stuff. There was something called Thonk. There was Aguirrefonte's Lyre. Lots of people were making this sort of DIY freeware software.
Mm-hmm.
I think Soundhack was one of the first ones, though. And it got out there. It built this big community. People knew who I was. It was, it made me somewhat famous
That's really neat.
among strange electronic music people.
Right.
So I did that until late 90s. And then it just got a little cumbersome, and I just wanted to shift gears a little, and started doing plugins around 99, 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still doing the plugins. And then from there, I started doing Make Noise. I'm really fast forwarding.
It's all right.
Yeah.
So how did you come to meet Tony Rolando?
Oh, I mean, I always go to the NAMM show.
Mm-hmm.
I used to go to a lot of different audio conferences. I go to less now. Used to always go to the tape op cons and AES shows. But NAMM's particularly fun because it's really not in any way an academic conference. It's really about people showing their new creations.
Right.
And that's why I love going there, is just seeing what people have made, what they're the strange things people made. I mean, at a certain point, it was all the new plugins and all the new software people were making, and you'd go from booth to booth of software developer, and they'd be, here's this new effect that automatically, does this kind of EQ. And I just talk to the people who created this stuff and make friends and find out what they did a little bit. And then the Eurorack booth started building, or Energy started building around that.
Right.
So, you'd see Plan B, you'd see Dopefer, you'd see all these early people. And I started checking that out, and I met Tony there when the year he came out with the Phonogene. Mm-hmm. And talked to him a lot about the Phonogene and does it do this, does it do that, those kind of things. And told him about my plugins. He looked those up later and gave me a call, and we started collaborating after that.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So this started at a NAMM show.
Yeah, it started at a NAMM show. Well, I mean, that's the nice thing about these things. It's a place to make new friends.
Yeah.
And find people to work with.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes you do just have to put yourself in a situation to make these connections happen.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's neat. So he followed up with you at some point about some kind of a collaboration or wanted to hear some ideas?
Yeah, and I don't know who had the first idea. It could have well been Tony. But I do know that my impression of Eurorack at that point, which is hard for one to perceive now, but at that point, synthesis was covered pretty well. Analog synthesis. There were lots of oscillators. People were starting to make sort of skiff-worthy stuff. Modules tended to be a little bigger, a little more basic. But yeah, people have developed a lot of filters based on, say, Oberheim designs or the WASP filter, definitely a lot of Moog filters.
Yeah.
And that was covered. But what I thought, my experience was in the tape electronic music studios of the 70s. That's where, I was initially exposed to it. And what I felt, the thing that's missing is any sort of tape component. You couldn't really build, something like an old Pauline Oliveris patch without some sort of tape, delay, feedback type mechanism. So I thought, well, what we need to do is we need to build a tape machine for Eurorack. And I thought a while about mechanical, magnetic ways of doing things, but all this is way too expensive. And the remarkable thing about Eurorack, even in the beginning, was how inexpensive it was. Even, you're rolling your eyes at me. But, I mean, the old modular stuff was so extraordinarily expensive.
Mm-hmm.
The
old... Dupfer is affordable.
Dupfer is affordable. Yeah,
okay.
You do have to buy one module at a time,
right.
But you can do it.
Right.
It was much different than buying a Moog modular or even...
or a Buchla system.
Or a Buchla system, which were, he built those, Don would build like 5 of one model or 20 of one model,
right.
And he priced them accordingly.
Yeah.
If you can imagine, if you're making 20 of something and you're staying in business...
There's something going on here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, this is manufacturing changed and Eurorack's suddenly affordable. And I thought, well, we can't do anything that's expensive. So we started thinking about doing a digital delay. And this became the Echophone.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I had previously done a bunch of plug-in delays. One is called Bubbler. The other one is called pitch delay, I think. I forget. But I made a number of, sort of like everything you can do with the delay, because when I made those plugins, I thought, oh, plugin delay is so boring. I've got to do something strange. So I did pitch shifting stuff. I had oversaturation in the feedback loop. I had compression in the feedback loop, fat filtering in there, all that kind of stuff. So I decided I wanted to bring that stuff to the Echophone. And what I brought to it was the pitch shifting aspect. And the other thing is the processor I was working with was very, very slow, or hard to work with. It was all integers, 16-bit. I had to do double calculations to do 32-bit, this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to get pitch shifting working in something like, in a very small bit of memory. I think it was maybe 2,048 samples. It was a kind of a distorted pitch shifting. But what I found is this kind of distorted pitch shifting gave this nice aggressive sound that when you turn the knob full on, you'd stand out in the live performance. So this was the design of the Echophone. It was pitch shifting on one side, standard delay on the other side, as few knobs as possible, just to keep it economical. Mm-hmm. The whole thing was based on the same hardware that the Phonogene used. So, I mean, for Make Noise, it wasn't risky to set me loose on this project. They had already made the hardware.
Right.
But I had my limits, and it did really well,
What a great team with you and Tony Rolando. I mean, I think that your, if I may say, tweaky past of what was, turning your ears on is such a great match with Make Noise's tweaky aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean,
is that an okay word to use?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a compliment. But,
yeah, tweaky's fine.
I mean, you were, even as an engineer doing.
My interest is always in sounds that I haven't heard before.
Right.
Or states of sound or combinations of sounds that seem strange.
Yeah.
That, sort of prick up the ears.
Right.
And
that's definitely Make Noise aesthetic.
And yeah, you wouldn't think a
sure.
company called Soundhack would get along with a company called Make Noise.
I know, it doesn't sound, it's very strange bedfellows, yeah.
Yeah, no, we got along.
We're being sarcastic here. Okay.
But our aesthetic aligned really well.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that Tony's analog work would complement my digital work pretty well too. So this is where we started.
This is one of the interesting things about Make Noise. One of the many is that he really does have his feet in the past with respect to the past, and then also with the present.
Yeah.
And also with both coasts. He is making very true analog stuff and really wacky Buchla stuff,
Yeah.
as demonstrated with the No Coast.
Yeah, well, we're both from the Midwest.
Right.
He's from Mid-State, Illinois.
Yeah.
And I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So, we're not coastal at all.
Right. You are No Coast, baby.
Yeah. Coast of Lake Michigan.
Amen.
Yeah.
So am I.
Yeah.
We talked about this previously.
Yeah, I mean, I've met a lot of people from Wisconsin, and we've sort of who are into synthesis, and we sort of joke about the Milwaukee music mafia. All of us who have come from, it's really strange how many electronic musician people have come from Milwaukee and thereabouts. But yeah, we got along sonically, and let's see, and yeah, the sort of East Coast, West Coast, No Coast thing it seems a little silly, but the thing is, at this point, we have access to all the old designs. We have access to a history of music. We've heard all that music. We found wonderful things in all these different areas, and it's not just sort of the East Coast, West Coast. There's, there are different countries too.
Yeah, right.
There's different cultures of music. There's different types of, dance music and ambient music and, it's tons of stuff to get into.
That's right.
So we're all inspired by all those things. And so we can say, oh, yeah, I love this thing that a certain, old Roland, box used to do or something, or some old, like the Polyvox filter where but if you go back to the 80s or the 90s, even, you wouldn't have awareness of a lot of these designs. They were just inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
But now, I mean, with sort of the international marketplace of eBay and the internet, you can buy a Russian synthesizer. You can listen to that. You can hear music from all over without any expense. You aren't reliant on the local record store to be stocking the records that you're interested in.
Right. It's like a wonderful thing and a really not wonderful. It's like both.
Yeah.
There's nothing like rifling through records in a record store and holding them up and smelling them and looking at them. But it's wonderful to be able to hear everything also.
But yeah,
it's a strange place to be.
We're definitely influenced by the ideas of the past.
Definitely, yeah.
And we draw on that. But you can draw on those things now, and everyone can.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, the difficulty is how many ideas there are in the past. And also, ideas from the past sometimes take on a certain glow. Like, this was this wonderful old thing. Where at the time, they maybe weren't successful at all.
That's so true.
Or else maybe they were successful and people heard them way too much, So you have to really use your ears and your judgment and sort of decide, well, yes, I'm listening to all these old sounds and I'm taking these different ideas. And yeah, the crackle box was this cool instrument, Do you know what a crackle box is?
I don't.
Okay, you'll have to look it up. But it was basically sort of like the old AM radio opened up where you can interact with the electronics.
Mm-hmm.
It's an instrument out of Stein, designed by, and I will not pronounce his name right, Michel Weiswitz. Okay, someone can correct me.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah, possibly that's right. And he performed with this little electronic instrument with little foil pads. And yeah, it was one of the earliest sort of, interactive analog electronic devices. But yeah, you go back to these old devices, you take a lot of ideas, but they really do have to become your own.
Mm-hmm.
And since there's so much accessible, at least for me, I feel there's quite a bit of responsibility in my own sound design to just build a device or build a software that opens up lots of avenues for people to use it. It can't be one. It can't just go in one direction. It has to go in many different directions. So that's really the challenge.
I think all of the Soundhack Make Noise products that defines them perfectly.
Yeah.
That's definitely how I felt playing with them. That they were very, they were very loosey-goosey. You could really you could drive them in any direction,
Yeah.
You can use Morphagene like a drum machine if you really wanted to.
Yeah.
That just sounds very strange. But you really can,
Yeah, we were thinking, well, this stuff has to be a modular, device, and it's going to interact with all the other devices. So you do want it to be modulated by envelopes, all that stuff.
It's interesting, some of the things that we had in the past that we really thought were great at the moment, like you were saying, and now, they were really crap. But now we look back on them with this nostalgia that it's so wonderful. So you were saying that it's important to differentiate what really was and what we can really work with.
Yeah.
That's interesting history,
Yeah, it's a hard thing to say. I try not to be critical of things, but
really old stuff.
Old stuff. Yeah,
we were laughing about like a DX7 or something.
Yeah, no, I found this wonderful thing about a DX7 that you could just send it random system exclusive messages. And if you could write a computer program that would just send random bytes into it, it would just make the most wonderful noises. But yeah, I'm getting off track.
I mean, programming FM synthesis is already pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about sending sysx dumps to a DX7. I mean,
Yeah.
this is, past most of us.
Yeah, I'm getting off topic here, but yeah, if we're going to have a coherent idea about old stuff, a lot of old electronics were just mainly difficult to use, and as we return to analog, we find some of the same problems, like, oh God, the knobs get dirty, the patch cords get filthy, oh, the gate from this thing doesn't quite work with the gate from that thing, so. It's and with older stuff it was even harder, but my point about going back to the past and looking at old ideas is that sometimes the ideas look really great. What you don't have a perspective on is really how well those ideas worked out in the past. So you might say, well, oh, I want to use this sort of frequency shifter, like a Bode frequency shifter, and it was a great idea. The sort of math around it was great, but it was hard to keep those devices calibrated. They maybe had to be tweaked each time. They were also very expensive, so yeah, you take those ideas and you sort of the recreation of any kind of idea is often. You have to look at the negative aspects of them as well,
right,
and rehabilitate them, or see what we can do in modern electronics to make them easier to use, maybe more stable, or maybe more unstable. Maybe there was one strange sound everyone loved. Well, maybe make that more accessible. So it's really an exploration of those old ideas and finding out what's there,
See, this is why I think talking with somebody like you is so fascinating, because, for the rest of us who aren't, engineers or programmers, we see products come at us and we can decide and try to differentiate, but we don't think or understand the process and some of the mentality that these things go through. And I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you might, because a lot of designing any sort of device is very much like patching a patch in a synthesizer. You set up pathways, you set up sonic possibilities, you put in different feedback paths, you set up certain things to be self-sustaining, you set up certain things to be more interactive, you set up a way for it to respond to your interaction. And definitely when I was programming all the devices, but let's say the Erbe-Verb, I was really thinking of that. I was inside the Erbe-Verb is really a sort of a modular patch. Now it's a really big modular patch. If you were to do that in modules, you would need a 6U to get it all working, and it would all have to work together in a really nice synchronized way. But it is just like designing a module is like making a patch.
At a really high level.
Yeah, at a high level. Well, you just take your time.
Right. I think I'm going to get to work tonight on building a module. I'm just going to take my time and start programming.
Yeah.
I'm just going to get right to it. I got some hot ideas.
Well, yeah. I've been working on this stuff for a long time.
Exactly my point.
When I did the Erbe-Verb, I actually did a literature search, where I just basically started pulling out articles on the theory of reverb. And every one of those articles would have a little bibliography at the end. And then I would look up all those articles. And then I would, some articles maybe were only in magazines that are no longer in print. So I'd start, emailing friends to see if they had a PDF of this or that. And soon I read maybe 20 articles on different ideas about reverb and how to build it. And all the while I was doing this, I was building every one of these ideas as a PD patch. So I was trying to make the sound. I'd look up a patent for a reverb, and then I'd try to build what was in the patent, and that way I understood it. So yeah, when I started doing the Erbe-Verb, Tony asked me, Tom, hey, we should do a reverb. That was his idea.
That's how this starts.
That's how it started. And I'm first, I have no idea what's going on in a reverb. And second, reverb's sort of like, it's a very static sound in a way. I was thinking spring reverb at the time. How can I make it different? And how can I understand this? So I actually spent a good long time studying reverb.
And what does a good long time mean?
About a half year of reading articles and building patches.
And then figuring out how to write it in Pure Data?
Yeah.
So you wrote that in Pure Data?
I wrote that in Pure Data. I also teach electronic music at UCSD, so Miller Puckett, who wrote Pure Data, has the office across the hall from me.
Oh my goodness. I did not know that.
I teach the undergraduate Pure Data classes. I mean, I started teaching him right when I just started to learn myself how to do Pure Data. So I used the teacher's trick of always being 2 weeks ahead of the students. And, it's fine. So I became very good at Pure Data. Now I can just sort of patch it instinctively. I know all the modules that are available, and I can put things together. Plus, I've programmed for years, so I can take my patch and object by object, I can recreate all those things in code and turn it into C code. So yeah, I have a lot of experience with that. So yes, you can't just, it is a sort of high level, I suppose.
Well, I'll just text you later and say, hey, Tom, I'm into it now. Can you help me with this line? And, I'm sure you can help me right through with it.
Yeah. You'd be surprised how many people do that to me.
I will not be one of those people.
Okay.
I won't do that.
Yeah, just stop by during office hours. We'll work on your patch.
So speaking of office hours, now you teach at UCSD, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
What are these 2 classes? You said you taught a couple classes there.
I teach 6 classes a year.
6 classes, all right.
Typically, I teach 3/4 of recording engineering, how to record acoustic instruments, how to integrate electronics, how to mix, master, track, all that stuff. I teach a class in computer music programming, where I teach students how to build their own plugins or their own modules in C. So in 10 weeks, we learn how to, I expect them to have a little bit of programming background, like Java or something. So we try to learn how to use C, how to how to make an oscillator, how to make a filter, how to make an envelope, how to connect them together, and then how to make a little GUI, or if we're doing embedded processors, we might look at how to integrate knobs, into the processor. So that
sounds awesome.
That's an advanced class. Grads and seniors take it.
So that's not the one that I'm going to be sneaking into the back of and
not initially
sitting in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I teach a class in Pure Data. So there we look at synthesis concepts, and there's maybe 40 people in that class. And I have the students do things like, today we're going to build a classic monosynth. Pick either the Erbe-Odyssey, the Pro One, or the Moog, and let's build them. Down to the GUI, and then my students come in with their imitations of these synthesizers that they've never seen, and they're just hearing them on YouTube videos.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's the class that I'm going to sneak into.
Yeah.
I'll just slip in the back. You'll see this older guy sitting in the back. Just ignore me.
Oh, you'll soon be helping everyone with their patches. The student,
that sounds like a great class.
Yeah, it's a fun class. At least for most of the students. Some students don't quite get it. Some students are just, don't know what they got into.
What am I doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like electronic music. Why can't we just use Ableton?
God.
Why can't I just use Massive?
Fruity Loops.
Yeah, I mean, they don't quite get that they can actually build this stuff too. That there could be a career made in making synthesizers, making effects boxes.
Yeah, right. Or, working for Native Instruments for Reactor, making
Yeah,
instruments
yeah,
for that.
yeah,
I used that for years. I love it.
yeah.
That kind of got me thinking modular, kind of opening up people's, Reactor instruments, looking how stuff was wired. And I had never made instruments myself, but, I felt close.
Yeah.
I felt close to getting there, man.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I just started because of maybe scarcity of resources in the studio. I just started building things.
So do you think that inspires a lot of your work now, where that thing hasn't been done yet, or it's something that you want to see happen? Like, how does that start? How does the idea start?
Well, I mean, I guess we could talk about the recent module, the Mimeophone.
Please do.
I mean, it's more or less fresh in my mind, though I tend to move on to the next project fairly quickly. But yeah, we finished the Miniphone last few months.
Yeah.
And my initial motivation at that point was really that there was a lot of delay areas I hadn't covered in the Echophone. So for me, Echophone was my exploration of distorted, sort of in-your-face, harsh feedback, squealing sort of delay effects. And with Mimeophone, I wanted to look at the sort of lush side, where things were thick and compressed and mushy and sounded like tape or sounded ambient, all these that sort of world. So my initial challenge was to do that, to make things that sound really deep and thick and clean and, warm. And yeah, so I got into it not because of a scarcity of delays, but more that I had a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted this certain device, and I hadn't ever made a delay that's, as warm as that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to see how far I could take it. How far can you take fat, warm, dubby sort of delay?
Right.
From there, it actually branched off into a lot of other areas. So there are harsh elements in it. But it was the first thing. I made a core that was very clean, that could sustain and feel thick, that had what I thought a more analog feel. Really what I mean by that is I wanted it to feel as thick as an analog delay. So if I'm in the studio and using like a space echo, you get this certain sense of warmth and body, and it's taking up a great deal of space. You turn on some digital delay, like a prime time or something, it has this very exact, clean quality, but it's a bit thinner, And so I wanted to make the Mimeophone have that kind of body. So it was a lot of work in getting the sort of feedback, filter, compression structure together so I could get that.
And also, last time you and I talked, you talked about ways to make it simple and very playable.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about some of that?
Yeah. That's always, with Eurorack especially, that's the problem. But when I was making plugins, I realized at one point I was just putting more and more knobs on the plugins. So I just told myself one day, okay, 12 is the max, and try for 4 if you can. So what I found is if you put so many knobs on something, there might be knobs that don't do that much, that are just little tiny subtle changes.
Right. Which take up more HP.
It'd take up more HP. So especially with hardware, every time you add a knob, you add HP, you add expense, you actually chew up a bit of your processor, sort of cleaning up that signal, making sure it's smooth, making sure it reacts. And it's good to think about, and yeah, you can make these knobs which don't seem to do anything. Right? You can make a design that becomes confusing. Like, okay, when I'm in this state, this knob is great. But if you get the module into another state, a knob might not do anything at all. Yeah. So I was trying to find parameters which would actually call multiple internal parameters. So I'd try for a sort of a conceptual idea of what a knob is going to do.
Right. Yeah.
And then that would actually be changing lots of elements within the device. And there are other things like internal parameters which change as you go from one range to another. So one thing I found is as you turn your delay to shorter and shorter times, once you get to the sort of millisecond range, you really want the feedback loop to be much more, I'm trying not to give away secrets here, much more saturated, much more aggressive. So short delay times, I wanted to get that aggression, so I changed everything inside the delay. So as you move to those shorter zones, it just started getting really much more in your face and much more immediate. It was much more reactive.
That must be really exciting to see those things happen in the design stage where you're seeing the lights go off like, yeah, this is great. This is fresh. You know?
Yeah.
That's neat.
I mean, one thing is we do a lot of variations when we're trying things out. So I'll send the beta testers maybe 3 versions of the firmware. It's like this one's brighter, this one's even brighter, this one's really dark, and they'll sort of like, what do you like? And they'll be of mixed opinions, and this one's clean, this one never distorts, this one always distorts, and we'll sort of throw these things back and forth. But what I find is usually there's a way to incorporate all these different designs into one. So when you go to a certain area, it might not only get bright, but it might also get more distorted at the same time, because that's the combination people like. So there's a lot of sort of parameter combination in all my modules. Yeah.
And I can imagine that it's hard also to want to, keep it small, HP wise, but give it all you can. Because from the end user, me, and all the, modular guys I know, it's like we want it all, but we want it small. But we don't want to get our big hot dog fingers in there too much.
Right.
But we understand that if it's big, it's awesome. That it costs more, so smaller's better. It's like we're kind of going back and forth all the time, like with these issues. Like as a designer, that must be, one of the biggest challenges, right?
I wanted this last one to be a little bit smaller. At the same time, we kept thinking of, we could add another button. We could add another knob. We can put this thing in.
And then you're going to be 20.
Yeah, we were thinking of like, we should do multi-tap delay. And eventually realized, it just makes things really huge. And once you have a lot of knobs to control all these taps, you don't, at least my take on taps and my use of, I don't like tweaking all this stuff individually anyways. So we tried different ways of approaching it. And we finally started looking at other things like what became our skew knob, where the 2 channels are now offset from each other. And it became a button. You hit skew and suddenly the time knob is controlling the left and right channel in opposite directions. So you can set these offsets. Then you release skew and you keep that offset. So we found these little elegant ways of compressing things, but also making it different. And when you compress things, it actually becomes a little more performable, because what used to take 4 knobs to set up, you can now set up with 1 or 2 knobs. Now, the other problem, if you do that too much, you end up with something where people don't even remember how to get in a certain state. It's so compact, or there's so many modes, they don't.
Yeah, that's a fine line too.
Yeah, so it was a balance between those 2 things. Keeping it small, being able to get your fingers in there, putting as many features in there as we can, and also don't put modes in there. Don't have it, okay, now it's a chorus, now it's a flange.
Right.
I always want to make it continuously moving from one thing to another, because I don't like that feel of sort of channel surfing for a sound.
Right.
I want to find that mutation between the two, the 2 sounds.
Yeah, I mean, everything you've done, in my humble opinion, is, it's like an adventure to get into.
Yeah.
That's the fun of the discovery of, your collaborations with Make Noise is, you've got to get into the mentality of the module. It might work for you, it might not. But for example, like Morphagene was the one that got me into Eurorack. For me, it just worked. I sat down and tried it at Analog Haven, got my hands on it, and for me, the knowing nothing about it, it just spoke to me, it worked. I got it.
From a designer point of view, you might think, wow, I want to do a looper. And you think, oh, let's check off a feature list of what we want to see in a looper. And certainly you do that. But if you're just looking at features that you want to put into things, you can end up with something that's just like every other looper that's out there.
Right.
Or it may just become a sort of copy. Like, oh, well, it's not even as good as this cheap looping pedal that I had. So I try to stay away from this sort of feature list idea for my designs. And I think every designer will take it in a different direction, but I think the important thing to do is to put your own aesthetic into a design, to put your own values into design. For me, it's playability and morphing and ability to get both clean sounds, dirty sounds, strange sounds, straightforward sounds, to get this sort of plastic, lots of different kinds of things out of the same module. And also to make the module engrossing. That is, you start playing with it and you just keep wanting to turn knobs. And that's always one of the targets when I build something. When I get to the point where I just start jamming on my own module for 2-3 hours, then I know I'm there.
Well, when Tom knows he's made something special, he's right. As I mentioned earlier in our conversation, his module called Morphagene was what originally got me into modular and made me aware that there was the kind of modules out there that I could use to create the kind of sounds I was hearing in my head and have a really good time making them also. I'll close out part one of this interview with an excerpt from a 24-minute improv that I did with Morphagene and marbles from Mutable Instruments. And if you're interested in the whole 24-minute clip, it can be found on my SoundCloud, which I'll link under this episode. I'm your host, Johno Wells, and this is Dotwave.